Welcome to the Spirit, State, and Society podcast with your hosts, André Gagné and Zachary Bourgeois, where we explore how global Pentecostal and charismatic movements intersect with politics, culture, and society.
All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to the podcast, to the last episode of Season 1 of the Spirit, State, and Society podcast. So this week's episode, what we're going to be looking at are what we'll call independent charismatic churches. These are churches that kind of combined all the different elements of essentially all the different types of Pentecostals and neo-charismatics that we've looked at up until this point. So just to give you a brief recap of them, to kind of recap this typology that we've been doing over the last, 15 episodes. If you don't remember all of them, believe us, we understand. So we started out with Classical Pentecostalism. The Pentecostals that we typically associate with the earliest form of the movement, of course, they still exist today, much more institutionalized. We're looking at Assemblies of God, the PAOC, the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. And these are typically Pentecostals where speaking in tongues is the sign of the baptism in the Holy Spirit. It is the evidence of that. We then looked at older independent churches. These were churches that were maybe predating Classical Pentecostalism or coming about at the same time, but were not associated, at least institutionally, with Assemblies of God, the type of Classical Pentecostal churches that we looked at in that first category. We then looked at charismatics, the churches that were part of the charismatic renewal. So this was Catholic charismaticism. We even talked briefly about Dennis Bennett and Anglican charismaticism. And then, of course, we went into the last category, which is neo-charismaticism. We talked about word of faith, what's commonly called prosperity gospel. We also talked about third wave, the idea of signs and wonders. This is when the type of Pentecostal spirituality that we saw before was coming in along evangelical theology with John Wimber. And of course, last time we were together, we talked about the NAR, specifically looking at the theology of Wagner, where we said that New Apostolic Reformation, if you look at it, we can consider it more of an ecclesiology, a way of doing church, where you have an apostle as the head of that. And of course, the NAR has come to be associated with a bunch of other type of theological elements like spiritual warfare. We didn't even get into dominionism, Seven Mountains Mandate, but we really wanted to say that at the core of what Wagner was talking about was apostolic governance.
Oh, my soul, and all, and all that's within Come on, somebody bless the name of the Lord. One more time. I will bless the Lord. Oh, my soul, and all that is within.
These independent charismatic churches, they're difficult to really categorize. They incorporate things from Classical Pentecostalism, from Word of Faith, and from the third wave. So they're very, very hard to pin down. But despite this complexity in terms of classification, there's scholars that will refer to these types of churches as emerging prophetic churches and ministries. Mm-hmm. So new prophetic churches, new prophetic ministries. And they're found in communities of all sizes. They attract congregations ranging from moderate to very, very large. And these communities are usually marked by a strong orientation towards the prophetic tradition. And many are led by young entrepreneurs, people that are very, very outgoing, but very young. So some of the leaders go as far as to adopt distinct titles and claiming some kind of, I would say, superior spiritual authority that clearly sets them apart from the ordinary believers in their own congregation when they exercise spiritual gifts. So some of the features that sometimes you can find in those types of churches, there is a emphasis on what some have called investigative prophecy, or sometimes referred to as forensic prophecy or individual prophecy, where leaders, what they do is they deliver highly personalized revelations to their followers. Sometimes these types of revelations can really include like information about phone numbers, license plate numbers, and even very, very intimate details of everyday life. Like a person has, their own personal lives, and they will have insight into that. When we look at this kind of prophetic manifestation, it really operates within a logic of dramatic disclosure. And this dramatic disclosure on the lives of individuals, what it does is it grants the person that is actually prophesying, the leader, a great amount of spiritual authority. Within those types of environments, what it creates, unfortunately, on the part of individuals in the congregation is a sense of fear and tension, because you're in the congregation and you don't know if the prophet is going to reveal something about your life that is hidden and that you don't want other people to know. So there's this sense of tension, sense of fear within the congregations. So prophecies, the way they operate often, they're kind of given to provide some kind of negative diagnosis on the lives of individuals, sometimes attributing believers that fail in their lives or that suffer in their lives. You attribute that to occult influences, curses. There's a lot of references to witchcraft, to spiritual types of attacks. So emphasis on spiritual warfare is very important. Within those types of churches, a strong emphasis on deliverance ministry, being delivered from forces of darkness. But unlike Pentecostal movements, sometimes even classical Pentecostal movements, that people will operate within the realm of deliverance, these new young entrepreneurs will sometimes require consultation fees from people. So you have a problem, you have to set an appointment with the prophet, and there's a fee so that the diagnosis can be made for a certain amount of money. And depending on the gravity of the situation, the fee can be, important or less important, depending on the amount. So when we, of course, find ourselves in the context of these churches, sometimes it's interesting. There's examples of this in the literature that we come across. Some church leaders often claim to perform a kind of supernatural intervention called miracle money, where suddenly funds appear in believers' banks accounts and money just appears.
Is it done in a way similar to prosperity gospel, where it's you say it and it happens, or is it something that the prophet
does?
The prophet does that.
And sometimes prophets will pray on people, and people will put their hands in their pockets. They'll find money in their pockets. There's maybe all sorts of explanations for that, but we're not going to go into that for now. What's important in terms of the prophecy and prophets, and the idea of fear and tension, is that within these types of churches and ministries, there's a deep-seated conviction that there is the existence of an enemy that is capable of intentionally harming individuals. So there is a heightened sense of spiritual warfare. So the enemy can take many forms. It could be, of course, the devil. It could be a human agent also. It could be another type of spiritual impediment. It could be a family member. It could be an outsider. It could even be the individual himself. So the concept of enemy in this context is broadened. So we're not just talking about Satan, but we can talk about individuals that are inspired by demonic forces that impede on an individual's life. So when you think about this, when people are faced with all sorts of different problems, like sometimes people can be infertile You know, a woman can have problems trying to bear children. There could be people experiencing mental disorders, poverty, repeated failure. They're not successful in their business or in their love life. They could be constantly plagued by illness, or they have death in their family. So often what happens is these are attributed to the enemy. But the enemy could be all of these different things at the same time, all these types of different impediments. So, you know, that's the kind of atmosphere that you find yourself in some of these types of churches, especially those that focus a lot on prophecy, prophetic leaders and things like that. And these leaders are very good. And by the way, they're young, like I said. They're like businessmen, they're entrepreneurs. They're good at self-promoting. They have capabilities, I would say, to navigate media. So you find them on Instagram, on a bunch of media, social media platforms. And they're able to capture younger generations using music, technology, again, social media, producing their own educational material. They're going to say, oh, okay, you can take this course and a series of, DVDs for this amount of money. If you want to know how to experience deliverance from poverty or from illness or whatever you need my series of videos or DVDs. You can only get them through me. You're not going to be able to find this anywhere. Eh? So they make money like that. They produce books, online courses, and videos.
And are these mostly located in Africa?
There's some in Africa, but I think this is essentially a global phenomenon because we're moving. Eh? So these ideas have been going around transnationally. So sometimes it starts in Africa, but then they move to global north countries. They start their own churches in Europe or North America. And these ideas circulate here. And they plant churches here. And they influence people from the global north. Eh? So even prophetic types of ministries that we're familiar with, we follow many of these types of ministries online. We know some of them. There's some that are global prophetic networks. They're very much influenced by these types of practices. The dosage of those practices can vary from one group to another, but you sense that we are in a new kind of neo-prophetic flow for all of these ministries. And the language often resonates with what we hear coming out of these prophetic ministries. Yeah. It's not surprising to see some of these things around us, even here in North America, for example.
I was going to say, when you're saying it, it reminded me of the stories of how Wagner was inspired by kind of the entrepreneurial, spiritual warfare-led ways of worshiping from Pentecostals that he saw in other parts of the world, right? So this new prophetic movement, how new is it? Was it part of what was inspiring Wagner, or is this after Wagner?
The research done on this, a lot of people say that there's a kind of an overlap between what Wagner was seeing and then what started to emerge in the 90s, 2000s, especially in certain countries like Ghana and Africa. But they're still, I would say, inheritors from what had traveled from the U.S. For example, what had traveled from the U.S., a lot of prosperity gospel preachers like Kenneth Copeland and others had came to Africa in some of these places and had, of course, influenced a lot of people with their ideas. And picking up from those ideas, a lot of these churches took on their own mantle in the sense that they became indigenous communities themselves, and they started their own ministries. And younger generations of preachers emerged out of that and created their own brand. There's a kind of a new brand that brings together all of these influences of classical Pentecostalism, third wave, word of faith, and produces this thing that we can call this independent type of charismatic churches. Like what I'm talking about in terms of new prophetic churches can be seen as one brand within that, because you can have other types of churches that put less emphasis on prophecy, for example. But what we see, one of the most, I would say, new features of this type of independent, neo-Pentecostal, neo-charismatic types of churches. So there's a kind of an overlap. I think there's, what we could see is there's seeds of that have been around before the year 2000. There's seeds of that elsewhere in the world. But now it's flourishing in a particular way that sometimes even when you ask Pentecostals, let's say even classical Pentecostals, what is this? They have a problem even trying to understand what it is. They have a hard time really identifying what these things are. So yes, probably what Wagner started seeing in other countries were a bit of that, but not the full-fledged expression of what we're seeing now. That is absolutely fascinating.
The answer that you have been asking God for has come. Listen to the message I have for you, sir. The Lord said to tell you, don't believe what the doctors say. What the doctors say concerning you is not correct. Roland. What's your name?
Roland.
So we've gone through this entire typology. We've done a lot of historical work too, talking about the effects of what Pentecostalism, Charismaticism, it can have on people, on society. We've talked about politics at certain points. For the listener coming out of the podcast of this season, what would be, let's say, the one thing that you think is like the important message of why it's important to study and to talk about Pentecostalism and Charismaticism?
It's because the growth of Pentecostal and charismatic movements is significant in the world. And as we said, it's the most important and significant expression of Christianity that's growing at the moment in the world. And this growth is largely attributed to the experiential dimension of the faith. So believers, of course, as we saw throughout this first season, they place a strong emphasis on practices such as prayer, healing, the manifestation of spiritual gifts. And these, of course, don't only enrich the individual spiritually, but also they reinforce communal bonds. And within these settings, the adherents find a sense of, I would say, supernatural empowerment, which enables them to engage actively in their communities and to imbue their lives with profound meaning. And that's why it's growing, and that's why it's important to study these movements.
How great thou art, how great thou art, then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. Somebody say, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art.
All right, everybody. So that's going to be the end of this episode, and that is going to be the end of this season. Thank you so much to everybody who's been tuning in all throughout this first season. We really appreciate the likes, the support, the comments that people have been leaving us. We're going to be taking a break over the summer. We're going to be putting out some bonus episodes here and there, but we're really going to come back for a second season proper in September, still talking about Pentecostalism, Charismaticism, and the different ways it operates in society, and also touching on politics. And we're really looking forward to the theme that we have in store. So one last time, I want to say thank you for tuning in and take care. We'll see you the next time. Thanks for tuning in to Spirit, State, and Society, the podcast where global Pentecostal and charismatic movements meet politics, culture, and everyday life. If this episode sparked your interest, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and drop us a message. Want more? Head over to our Substack page to subscribe and access other episodes, resources, and fresh insights you won't want to miss. We've got more thought-provoking conversations coming your way, so stay connected, and we'll see you next time on Spirit, State, and Society.